How much bad news can one bear? First, we were hit by the coronavirus, which led to the forced closure of all but essential businesses. It also led to social distancing, which cut us off from people we love. Then we were hit by a flare-up in racial injustice, which was followed by protests, by arguments, by violence, looting, destruction, tearing down of statues, and destruction of property. Finally, we actually felt that we were seeing glimmers of hope as people began to get together to say, what can we do about racial injustice? And also as the governor came up with his California roadmap to recovery, we began to see businesses reopen. We thought maybe we're coming out of it. But now, entering into our 4th month since the closures were mandated, and with a recent surge in COVID-19 positive cases, some of us who have just gotten back to work are being told we have to close our businesses again. And there are warnings that there may be even more closures on the way. How much can we take? Will there ever be an end to this wilderness experience we're going through? It seems to be the nature of wilderness experiences, that the very things that make them wilderness experiences for us, that normally we don't have control over how long they last. That's why it feels like a wilderness. But as this wilderness experience continues, it seems we still have more to learn about how God works in our wildernesses. We've been looking at that for several months now. There's still more for us to learn. Today, facing business reclosings along with the ensuing and additional strains in our financial and other resources, I believe that God wants to both instruct and encourage us by the way in which he used Elijah in the lives of 2 widows, 2 women who were in destitute situations and did not know where to turn for hope. Their stories are found in 1 Kings chapter 17 and in 2 Kings chapter 4. To be a widow in that time was to be without much help. The temple did help a little bit, but there was really no such thing as government welfare, as taking care of moms. So when a woman was widowed, unless she had capable adult children, she would usually end up destitute. Such was the case of both of the widows in both of our passages. The first widow we're told about in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 through 16. She would not even have been able to get help from the temple because she wasn't Jewish. She lived in Sidon, which was another area. And not only was she a widow, they had been facing a drought for several years, to the point that even the rivers and the brooks dried up. There was very little to be had. Now, what's strange in this account is that God told Elijah to go to the town where she lived and that she would supply him with food. In chapter 17, verse 10 and 11, it tells us that when he got to the town, he saw a widow a woman who was picking up sticks. So he asks her, would you please bring me some water? And as she goes to do that, he adds, oh, and by the way, would you also please bring me a piece of bread? Now, God had told him that a widow would supply his needs, but surely it wouldn't be this widow. I would have a hard time asking anyone who looked like they were hurting to help me out. It turns out that she was so destitute that she tells him in verse 12, I don't have any bread. In fact, I only have a small handful of flour in a jar and a little bit of oil in a jug. In fact, I'm gathering a few sticks so I can go and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and then die. I don't know about you, but I've never even been anywhere near that desperate. to know that this is your last meal because you haven't got anything more? Now, what you'd expect a man of God to do on hearing a situation like this would be to step in and say, "Don't worry, ma'am, I'll take care of it, all of this, and I'll take care of you and your son." And then he would come up with plenty of food and other items for them. Wasn't he a prophet? Couldn't he speak for God and have an in with God? But Elijah said something that really sounds quite selfish. He tells her in verse 13, "Don't be afraid. You go ahead and do as you've said. But first, make a small loaf for me and bring it to me. And then you can make something for you and your son." How selfish could he be? First, look after my needs, and then you can go take care of your own. And then he adds in verse 14, "Well, you can do this, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil that you have will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain again on the land." Now, a cynical person would really sneer at that line. "Oh, yeah, sure. You get her to give you what she has first, and then watch it run out. Oh, that's really godly." The truth is, when we see our resources dwindling, our natural response is to cling to them. And that really makes sense if that is all there is, or if God really is not involved. If God isn't there, if that's everything there is, it's every person for themselves. Watch out for yourselves. But Elijah reminds us that even in our most dire time, God is there, and he does care about what happens to us. But he wants us to trust him and to do whatever he asks us to do. It's kind of like the trapeze artist who we're swinging on one trapeze and he's on the other, and he's saying, "Now listen, when we get to this point, you need to let go, and then I will catch you and bring you back over to this other side." Unless we release the things to which we're clinging, we will never be caught and carried to the other side. Just as Elijah asked the widow to give him the one thing that she had left before he could fully provide for her, God asks us to give him what we have, so that our trust is not in what we have, but in who has us. In verse 15 and 16, we're told the result of this. "She went away and did as Elijah told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah." Either God is God or he is not. Either God is God or he is not, and it is in our wilderness experiences that we discover that he indeed is God when we're willing to give him what we have, if he asks it of us, even if it's the last thing that we have. Now, the second widow is in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. She found herself in equally dire straits. Now, she was not necessarily starving to death. We don't know that, though she did tell us that she didn't even have flour in her house. In her house, in verse 2, she tells Elijah that she has nothing there at all except for one small jar of olive oil. She was facing the forced enslavement of her two sons because her husband, who had died, had a remaining debt, and that debt had to be paid. Now, her situation is really hard for us to even comprehend. But even not that long ago, about 100 years ago, in England, if a husband owed a debt, he could not declare bankruptcy, nor did his death clear the debt. Somebody had to pay the debt, and that usually was done by either sending somebody to the workhouse to work it off, or to sell the wife and the children into slavery to pay off the debt. Here she was faced not only with the death of her husband, but she also stood to lose her sons immediately, as well as any hope of future support that they could give to her. Now again, I've never been anywhere near experiencing anything like that. Have you? And what Elijah asks of her probably sounded just as bizarre to her as his command sounded to the widow in Sidon. He tells her in verse 3 and 4, "Now I'll tell you what, go around and you ask all of your neighbors for empty jars, not just a few, get a whole bunch of them. Then you go in your house, shut the door, and you start pouring out of that little, that jar with a little bit of oil, you start pouring that into the jars. And every time they fill up, you set them aside and bring another jar and you fill it some more until they're all gone." A cynical person would say, oh yeah, great. She's already vulnerable. Now you're asking her to go do something will make her look like a fool. That's really godly. You're setting her up for failure. And again, if God is not God, if we only have our own resources to rely on, doing something like that would really probably make us look foolish. But Elijah reminds us that God is God. And he can still take the little that we have to give him and multiply it. In verse 5 and 6, we're told that like the other widow, she did as Elijah had told her to do. And the result was that the oil kept on pouring until every jar she had borrowed was full. But God went beyond reproducing oil and filling up her jars. She and her sons couldn't live just on olive oil. When she went to him and said, "I've done what you've asked and they're all full," Elijah told her to go and sell the oil. And when she did, it was enough not only to pay off her husband's debt, think about that, but also to give enough for her and her sons to live on. In our own current dire straits, when we don't know what to do, God sometimes asks us to do something that feels foolish. Again, as before, what he's asking of us is to put our trust in him, not in our own resources. For you see, only as we do so will we recognize that it is his doing and not ours when he brings us out. In your current wilderness experience, what is God asking of you? Is he asking you to give him the one thing on which you've been counting? Or is he asking you to do something, to take a step or something like that seems and feels kind of foolish? Whatever he's asking of you, what he's really asking is, will you trust me to be God in your circumstances, in your situation, even when you can't figure out how I could possibly do that? Will you trust me? Sometimes it's easier to hear what someone is saying when it's put to music. And as I was reflecting on this passage, the following hymn came to mind. He gives us more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sends us more strength when the labors increase. To added afflictions he adds his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he gives us and gives us and gives us again. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed before the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving is only begun. His love has no limit. His grace has no measure. His power has no boundary known unto men. For out of His infinite riches in Jesus, He gives us and gives us and gives us again. And that is the good news.